finished up last time starting to talk about the Dawes Act. Here's what to remember about the Dawes Act. And yes, I do consider it very important. They gave the Indians, see, again, because a lot of Americans believed the Indians were treated unfairly, so they said, let's see if we can't get these Indians off reservations and onto farms. So they gave the Indians outright 160 acres. Now, folk, there have been many a time in history when people were given land by the government. It has not worked. Anyway, these Indians were given the land per family, 160 acres per household. It crippled Indian culture. Indian culture was tribal, not based on families like white European culture, but based on tribes. The tribal culture was crippled up, and finally, the United States allowed the Indians to own their own land tribally. You know, where the tribe could buy maybe several hundred acres of land, even, where a tribe could get the land, whether by buying or by having it outright given to them, but it was done by tribe. And this worked better for the Indians because it was more in keeping with the Indians' way of life, the life that they had known for centuries. Geronimo kept fighting the whites, but eventually he was hunted down. He was forced to an agreement. The white people at this time were feeling sorry for the Indians, so Geronimo was allowed to return home. And he later became something of a celebrity. Now, if you go to Douglasville, to a Dairy Queen, you'll see pictures of Geronimo and a short article about him there at that Dairy Queen in Douglasville. Again, like I say, he's something of a celebrity. Some Indians resorted to spiritual means to defeat the whites. They realized their bows and arrows and their guns and whatever wouldn't do it. They lacked the numbers, so they resorted to the ghost dance, believing the dance would destroy the white people. They did put fear of the whites living nearby. The ghost dancers were believed by the whites to be calling up evil spirits that would harm them and would make them have bad dreams or destroy their mind. Sitting Bull participated in a ghost dance in 1890, and he was killed. The last big massacre of the Indians occurred at Wounded Knee Creek, and after that the Indians quit fighting. When the Indians quit fighting, the white man quit also. The Americans then began to take their imperialist ambitions into Asia, where we got the Philippines. This was later. We got the Philippines, we got Puerto Rico, which we still have. The Philippines we gave back. We have Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Guam, Wake Island, Hawaiian Islands. There was Latin America, the Caribbean, Pacific Islands, which we wound up taking over, most of which we still have. Puerto Rico we still have.
Huh? You went crazy with that. I don't know why.
As I've already mentioned, gold was discovered in California in 1848. It led to a huge gold rush. People went to California. Well, some of them went overland, some of them went by sea and went across the Isthmus of Panama, and some of them, let's see if I can, oh yeah, right here, this is a map that might explain it. In other words, some people in a rush to California went straight across by horse and whatever this way. Some went by sea down here, crossed the Isthmus of Panama. In those days there was no Panama Canal. Then took another ship up this way. And some people took the long, long route around South America, down the Strait of Magellan. But these people were mostly called 49ers. The gold was discovered in 1848 and 1849. A lot of the Californians arrived. I myself am a 49er, but it was 1949, not 1849. Anyway, I think that's a little bit off this topic. Eventually, other minerals were mined. Silver towns went from boom to bust. One of the most famous towns that went from boom to bust was Tombstone in Arizona, where Wyatt Earp and the two Earp brothers and Doc Holliday had a shootout with three men, three cattle rustlers. The fact is, if you actually look at the personal lives of all 7 of the men who shot it out at OK Corral, both sides, Wyatt Earp and his 2 brothers were little more than outlaws themselves. Doc Holliday was certainly an outlaw, but sometimes the bad guys finish each other off so the innocent and the good could go on with their lives. Anyway, these towns would come along and then become ghost towns. Comstock Lode had the richest vein of silver found on the North American continent. People came to it from China, from Japan, from Latin America, from Canada. This discovery, though, meant disaster for the Indians. Some of them tried to adapt. The mining was dangerous. They had no air conditioning, no fans that would blow in the mines, no electric lights, and no warnings that devices that would warn you. Now, sometimes they carried candles. When the candle went out, that meant you'd better leave yourself, because the candle required oxygen in order to burn. But otherwise, they had no real way to tell when the carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide level was too high. Federal government often neglected its territories. The president might appoint a governor, a few judges. A lot of these territories took a long time to achieve statehood. New Mexico was the last one. New Mexico came to the Union in 1912. After California, Nevada was the first of the other states to come in. Nevada may have come in because people liked the gambling that it offered. Nevada had some of the more liberal laws, some of the most liberal laws in the country that allowed gambling, prostitution, and a few other things. So yeah, and easy divorces. Even when I was a child, people would go to Alabama if they wanted a divorce and get their divorces in Alabama. Today, of course, divorce is pretty much easy in every state. The Wild West, it was called. A lot of duels, a lot of crime, a lot of fighting. The federal government usually left things alone. A few agents from the government who went west were oftentimes intimidated into returning home. Blacks and Hispanics were there and often discriminated against. Mormons faced hostility and prejudice. But then they built Salt Lake City. They built up the state of Utah. They did not become a state right away until they abandoned or renounced the practice of polygamy. Chinese kept coming in spite of being discriminated against. The Chinese Exclusion Act kept a lot of them from coming. Simply, the Chinese had to cross the ocean in ships, and a lot of ship captains would not let them in. So that did a lot to keep a lot of them away. Cattleman and farmer, that was the real strife in those days. Cattlemen fought sheep herders. Now here was the problem, folk. When sheep graze, horses and cattle cannot graze because a sheep's tooth, it comes out almost out of its lips. And when sheep graze, the grass is so short that your horses and cattle with their thicker lips simply cannot, their teeth cannot reach the grass after sheep have grazed on it. It takes weeks for the grass to grow back. So the sheep herders, or the cattlemen said, you get your sheep off of this territory. Farmers, again, the problem that farmers had, farmers put up barbed wire fences to keep cattle from overrunning their farms. And the farmers resented this, and also farmers put up barbed wire fences around their ponds to keep cows from drinking all their water. In the long run, the farmer won. A terrible winter, so a series of terrible winters occurred in the late 1887, 1888, that time period, where that big storms blew in and destroyed a lot of the cattle. And after that, the cattlemen decided we better build barns, keep our cattle fenced in, build barns, and and trim the size of our herds. And that way, when a storm came up, the cows could easily get inside the barns and be safe from just about any storm. So in the long run, the cattlemen wound up copying the farmers. Now, folk, even out west, the Indians fought each other. The idea, and a lot of you have, a lot of us who picked up on the idea that the Indians were living at peace with each other till the white man came. This is simply not in accordance with the facts. The Sioux Indians, particularly, while most Indian women only had 1 or 2 babies per woman and their populations declined, Sioux Indian women had 6 to 8 babies per woman. And in short order, in a few generations, the Sioux greatly outnumbered the other Indian tribes, and they poured in from Minnesota, where the Sioux started, and headed toward the Great Plains. And they began to conquer the weaker tribes. More and more Americans moved west. 2 of my great-grandfather's brothers, my great-grandfather remained in the east, but 2 of his brothers went west, Jacob and Levi by name. Jacob lived and died a bachelor. Levi has a lot of children, and Levi's descendants still live in the state of Washington to this day. Again, Homestead Act, passed by a Republican Congress during the Civil War. It said that if you can live on 160 acres, it said the federal government would give you 160 acres if you could live on that land for 5 years. And a lot of persons took them up on it. Now the problem was with the Homestead Act, it was just not any land. You had to live on land that nobody owned. And the only land that would qualify would be this land here in the Great Plains or the land out west. And the problem was a lot of this land was bad land, and the 160 acres simply, but they wound up over farming it. And in the long run, this led to the big dust bowls of the 1830s, the dust storms. The cattle and horses just ate up all the grass, and no new grass was allowed to grow in its place. And eventually the wind started blowing, and the dust killed a whole lot of people. So the Homestead Act, again, was not as great as it might sound. Four rail lines wound up joining east and west. The first one was the Transcontinental Railroad, built in 1869. Then the Great Northern Railroad, the Union Pacific Railroad, and then there was another railroad here in the south. 4 railroads, your book shows a map of them, joined the eastern part of the United States to California, Oregon, and Washington. And these railroads made transportation between east and west much faster than otherwise would be, especially since the trains could move day and night. You might ask, well, how did the captain of the train manage to work 24 hours? The answer is he didn't. He'd go back to the caboose and sleep in a caboose while the assistant ran the train at night. Then when daylight came, the captain would come back up and he'd run the train, and the 2 men would take turns, so sometimes maybe 3 men would take turns keeping that train going, but the train would go day and night. They could get from the east to the west in a matter of a couple of days. In the Midwest, in the Great Plains, a lot of persons would just dig like a hole in the ground, live in dugouts. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862. By 1870, most of the good land was taken. The railroads got a lot of the land. The Great Plains at one point had a period of abundant rainfall. That's a start. Then came the drought, and many farmers lost everything that they had due to the drought. Oklahoma, which had been promised to the Indians, opened up its land to white settlers, and there was a big land rush in which people would just rush like crazy. And a lot of persons were killed for their land. People would try to stake out land and someone else would stake it out, and one person would kill the other. The cattle were driven to market on trails. One of the most famous is the Chisholm Trail. The Chisholm Trail started out in Texas and wound up in Dodge City, which was called the cowboy capital of the West. Other trails also. Now these, you can imagine these cattle, they were driven by the thousands, and the cowboys would ride on horses and they would use dogs to help keep the cattle from straying. And every once in a while the cattle would stampede, and it became difficult to control. Cowboys eventually became hired hands. There was one rich man would own all the cattle. They'd have a roundup time, and well, they'd know which cattle was theirs by putting a brand on the cattle. They'd take a hot iron with a brand on it and get the iron really hot, and then put it on the cow's fur, or the cow's hide, and the cow or the calf was permanently branded. And then come roundup time to look for their calves, or whatever, which by this time were grown, look for their cattle. And yes, they would oftentimes take cattle they knew belonged to someone else. The cattle were grown in open range, and they would often mix with each other. Your cattle would mix with mine and whatever. Eventually, farmers were forced to work on land that they had no chance to own. There was no 30-year mortgage. A few wealthier farmers got most of the land. Again, the farmer won the fight with the cattleman. Farming replaced cattle raising as the best way to make a living. A lot of Texans began to grow cotton, like they'd seen done in places like Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama and South Carolina. Farmers began to grow cotton. Because of mechanization, things like the reaper and the plow, and even the steam tractor, this meant that farms had better yield, and Americans started feeding people abroad, and this is still true. Americans grow a high percentage of the world's food, and we ship a lot of it abroad. But again, a lot of persons are wondering, when the present generation of farmers retired, the younger generation, their children do not want to take over the farm, and nobody knows who the farmer of the future is going to be. Farmers would use their entire crops, pay off debts, then have to borrow money to live till the next year. And inevitably, what happens when you live this way, always in debt, there came a bad year, Depression year, 1893, and a lot of farmers lost their lands to creditors. My mother and dad used to tell us kids, don't ever mortgage your house, don't ever mortgage your house. I think just about all of us have. It's the only way you have a chance to get it. And if you can't pay the mortgage, you lose it all. That has not happened to any of us yet. But it did happen. There have been times in history when everybody has lost their land, lost their homes. But then again, if you're paying rent, if you don't pay the rent, you're evicted. So what's the big deal? What's the difference? Paying a mortgage is somewhat like paying rent. You have, in fact, in a lot of cases, paying a mortgage is cheaper than paying rent. All right. Annie Oakley, Buffalo Bill, Annie Oakley, and Sitting Bull went around the eastern coast, went around the eastern part of the country, putting on shows. They'd often play Custer's Last Stand. Annie Oakley was extremely accurate with a rifle. Her husband would hold out a dime, and she would shoot the dime out of his hand. Now, if you think she was faking it, they would pick up the dime later and found that it had been a good fresh dime had been hit by a bullet. She actually could, and when Annie Oakley shot a bird, you knew you could eat a bird without your teeth biting into the lead, because once she shot the bird in the head, never missed. I mean, she was extremely accurate. When I said about shooting, my daughter, who's about the age of some of you, is a better shot than I am. It took me years to realize when you're pulling that trigger, you don't jerk your hand back. You squeeze the trigger Some of you know what I'm talking about. You squeeze, because when you jerk your hand back, you inevitably lose the aim you had. And when I was in the Army, I did not go with a gun, but eventually I learned, bang. Well, going to a range is expensive, so I don't go very often. I haven't been to a range in years. But anyway, like I say, my second daughter has always been a better shot than I am. Annie Oakley, again, could hit a dime. All right.